Hi everyone, my name's Declan McGlynn. Welcome to Friday Forum Point Blank's weekly broadcast, bringing you exclusive tutorials, artist interviews and industry insight every Friday from East London. Today we're taking a look at the brand new version of iZotope's acclaimed mastering software, Ozone. So I'm joined by Point Blank instructor Anthony Chapman. He's going to be running us through what's new in Ozone 6 and throwing in plenty of mastering tips along the way. And if you want to learn more about mastering your own tracks, you can find out more about our mastering courses both online and here in London at pointblanklondon.com. Anthony, welcome back.
Well, it's good
been
to
a while.
be back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And most people probably know you from your last Ozone 5 video.
It's been very popular.
It has been, yeah.
To say the least.
No pressure for this one.
No, absolutely not. Yeah.
So Ozone 6, it's here. What's it like? You like it? Good
I
time?
really like it, yeah. I've been playing with it for about a week. I say playing with it. I actually did master this track that I'm going to show you. This is one that I mastered for real.
Okay.
Because I often find with new software, the best way to learn it and the best way to get to know it is to actually do something for real, you know. So like when Logic X came out, because I teach on that here, I made myself mix a track in it because I was teaching mixing, you know, that kind of approach. So really I wanted to dive straight into this and actually master something. Now, what I'm using here is Ozone 6 Advanced. So I'm going to try to be as clear as I can about what is only in Advanced as opposed to regular Ozone. In my opinion, regular version of Ozone 6, same as the regular version of Ozone 5, which is what I used to use, and I use that, you know, commercially, is absolutely great. Yeah, that's really, it's got everything you need, but there are specific sort of usage scenarios where you might find the extra little things in Advance are really useful. If you're serious about mastering and mastering for other people, I would say Advance is always worth looking at. If you can afford it, check it out, try and get to know exactly what that will give you. It's going to give you some extra options. So what I want to start with is looking at probably the biggest change in Ozone 6, which is that Ozone is now a standalone app as well as a plugin. Now for me, this is fantastic because sometimes I find mastering in the DAW environment a bit of a pain. It's a bit clumsy. For me, there's a lot of unnecessary kind of mousing around, and then when you come to bounce out all of the tracks, sometimes it can be a little bit involved. So what iZotope have done is they've created a specific app for Ozone 6. It's still a plugin as well, and with Advanced, you also get the individual modules from Ozone as individual plugins too.
Okay.
But if you have the regular Ozone 6, you've still got the VST, Audio Unit, and AAX plugins. So you can still use them like that, because I know a lot of people, from the comments we had on the Ozone 5, a lot of people use Ozone for mixing as well, and I do sometimes too. Some of the modules are really useful for mixing. So even if you've got the normal version, not the advanced, you can still use the plugins, that's fine. But what I've got here is the standalone app. That's what I'm going to focus on for today. And I just want to quickly show you the way it's kind of laid out and why I think that it's got some real advantages. So you can see what I've done here is I've loaded in this track. And this is a track kindly donated by Bass Equals Win, my friend Terry, Atomic Hooligan. This is it's from a compilation that he's putting together. And I've loaded the track into Ozone, and you can see we've got our waveform there. Now I can add more tracks, so I could just add, you know, for example, let's just pop another one in there. So if I load up another track, and then we get another tab with our second track in it.
Okay.
So we can kind of move between our tracks like this. So if you're mastering an album, you can load up all of your tracks and work on them all in the same instance of the app. We can copy the settings from one track to another. And it's great. It's just really tidy for me. It's really nice just having this one-stop shop to go and work on all this stuff. Now, as you can see, we've got the waveform there, and one interesting thing is that as well as just loading the sound in, we can do a bit of trimming and fades. So if I just kind of zoom in here, I'm zooming in there with the mouse wheel, I can grab this to trim and then also do fades as well like that. Okay, so this is great because this could save you a lot of time. I know it's going to save me a lot of time. In terms of actually authoring CDs, because even when I'm mastering stuff for digital, I tend to treat it as if it's a CD. When I'm like making the final master, I'll usually make a DDP image. And so I still use some other software for this, but I can do all of my initial fades and topping and tailing here. And that's, again, just going to save me time when I get out into DSP Quattro, which is what I use to do that. So if we go back to this first track here, now we're looking here at the modules that we've got. Now, most of these are going to be pretty familiar from previous versions of Ozone. The big new one is here, the dynamic EQ, which we're going to look at in a little while in sort of detail. But the rest of the modules are all very familiar: the EQ, the dynamics, the exciter, the stereo imager, and then we've got the maximizer, the limiter. We've also got the post EQ as well. Personally, it's not something I use a lot, but it's there if you need it. But what is really exciting about the app is that we can also host plugins as well.
So third-party
We can
VST
host third-party VST and audio units. Yeah.
Wow, okay,
so,
cool. Nice
so
one.
this is really cool. So for example, let me give you a sort of classic sort of usage case. If we go in here and get this T-Rax Fairchild Compressor model, which I quite like. And so I've opened that up and it's gone in that end module there. I can drag this back to the start and then I can start basically using this to do some bus compression to start, okay? And then we can do this with any plugin at all. One thing I haven't tested yet is whether we can host Ozone 5 in there, which is something that I would be interested to do because...
Or Ozone 6.
Yeah, well, whoa. That's
Let's
quite a
keep it
good
simple,
idea though,
yeah.
it's quite a
Just
good
hosts
idea.
itself over and over again.
Exactly. But because there have been a few changes, I know some people have registered some sort of disdain at the fact the reverb module's gone.
Okay.
But for me, that's not a huge problem. And most of the people who are moaning about it have upgraded, so surely they've got 5 as well. So, you know, I don't think it's the end of the world. And I think the fact we can insert plugins in the app means that you could just use whichever reverb you like. If you want to use reverb for mastering, which sounds weird, but is actually quite useful sometimes. Yeah. So that's the plugin hosting, which is super, super cool. That's really, really exciting. Now, if we take a look at, if we take a look, should we take a look at the dynamic EQ?
Yeah.
Should we look at that next?
Yeah, sure.
So let's fire this up. Now, this is a really interesting development for Ozone. So I've dropped the dynamic EQ in here at the end, and I'm actually going to pull it back, and I'm going to put it before the limiter. Okay. Now, dynamic EQ. So dynamic, obviously, is suggesting movement. Normally, you know, we've got our dynamics section here. This is our multiband compressor. Dynamic EQ is effectively the marriage of the two together. So it's an EQ, but we can also use threshold on the EQ to make the EQ either push stuff up or pull stuff down when it gets to a certain level. So let me just give you a quick example of this. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm just going to turn the limiter off for a sec. So if I grab this band here and pull this down, so you'll see that as I'm pulling that down, this is showing us what the actual EQ is doing. It's dynamically pulling down on it. Now this kind of stuff is really useful if you've got a track that you're mastering and when you get to a certain point, there's one frequency area that like leaps out, or vice versa, one that you really need to push out. You can use this to do that. Now we've got the threshold here, so we can either back that off, so it's just tickling it a little bit, or we can be really extreme. Okay, so, and we've got attack and release there as well. This is set to the proportional Q curve, so that's going to keep, the Q is going to keep proportion there. If we put it on the bell, this is more like the kind of traditional thing that we'll be doing. We can, you know, we can play with the Q this way. And one little tip, I know that I covered in the old video, but it's the same here. Generally speaking in EQ mastering, I always do narrow cuts and broad boosts. You need to be surgical with the cuts to take out those specific things that you really are problematic. But if you keep your boosts broad, they're going to sound musical. Because if we go into our normal EQ here, so you can see this is the EQ curve I've been using on this track, and this is exactly the kind of EQ curve I would tend to use in mastering. It's relatively sane, you know. It's it's quite unusual you would see something I've mastered with really wild EQ, unless there's huge problems with the source material. But you can see this frequency here, if I hold down Alt, So that's a real sort of pokey, slightly sort of muddy frequency. So I've zoomed in on that by holding down Alt and finding like the one that I want to work on. And then I boost it up to work out what's going on there. And then I've like gone down and cut that, and I make sure the Q is really narrow, and I'll kind of fine tune it that way. But if we do the same, or if we look up here, if I grab this, in fact, let's put another band in, let's put band 4 in. If I make the Q on that super narrow, and then I boost that up, it's really ringy and horrible, like, you know, it's just not musical at all. But if we make it the Q really wide, we go like that, then we can get away with it. Because that's going to sound more musical. I don't actually need a boost like that on this track. But if you, for me, that's the golden rule about EQ in mastering, is narrow cuts and broad boosts. But if we pop back to the dynamic EQ, I think it's got some really important sort of uses just for subtly taking care of stuff. I think really it is closely related to you know, the multiband dynamics, to a multiband compressor. But I just think in terms of a subtle tone shaping tool, it's going to be really, really handy.
Yeah.
You know?
One thing I was playing around with it as well during the week, and one thing I found really useful was if you're mastering a drums, if you want to take out some boxiness from the kick, but that's where the fundamental of the snare is.
Exactly.
You can just drop in the dynamic, and it only ducks when the kick comes and leaves that energy for the snare.
Absolutely, yeah. It's got some really, and again, I think that's got really important mixing connotations as well.
Yeah.
I can definitely see myself using the individual module, because with Advanced we get the individual modules as plugins. I can 100% see myself using that as a mixing tool. So stuff like, I think stuff like this is really useful, where I've got the Baxandel filter there, which is quite subtle, you know. And if I was really sort of just wanting to fine tune the bottom end, see, I can, like, if we pull that threshold down, that's really making a big cut. But if we keep it subtle there, so if we look at this, when that big bass is playing, it's really pushing down, but then when it stops, it like releases, and it's just reacting a bit to the kick. So that sort of stuff can be really useful. My one tip related to this, I would say, and it's the same with the multiband compression, is don't overdo it. Don't think that you need to flatten everything out.
Yeah.
It's just a little helping hand, you know. And I mean, really, the number one thing with mastering for me is just you need to learn to trust your ears. You know, you really, really need to learn to trust your ears.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you mentioned the maximizer had improved as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's have a look at that. So one thing, if we turn that back on, okay, I'm just going to turn the dynamic EQ off for now. One thing related to this is if we have a look down here, you see we've got this little ear. And this is a feature that used to be in Ozone 5, but was actually hidden away in the preferences. And this effectively, when this is turned on, what happens is that when we bypass Ozone, it's going to match the level that was coming in. So this is why we're seeing clips here. It's not actually clipping. But if I hit bypass, it's going to try to match the flat signal to the level that we're getting out of the limiter. So if I hit bypass, so it's the same level, but without the processing on it. So it's actually gained on. So obviously we're going to get some clipping. It's not the end of the world at this stage, but the advantage of this is we can truly judge what our mastering is doing. So that's bypass, and then that's what it is. So you can see one of the things I've really done with this track is there's some boxiness going on in the sort of mid-range. And that's, a lot of that is kind of to do with this here, but also in just sort of tidying stuff up here in the multiband dynamics. But if we look at the limiter, so
what's a good RMS level for tracks in general?
Yeah, I think we were talking about this before, weren't we? And I know -10 is quite a good sort of catch-all level. If you're not a really experienced mastering engineer, I think -10 dB RMS. Remember, RMS is a measurement of the signal which is averaged out over a certain period of time. It's a much more accurate way of telling how loud something is. Because if you think about, if you have a 4 to the floor kick drum and each one of those peaks at 0 dB, Well, that's at 0 dB for that instant when the kick drum happens, but in between it, it's not.
Yeah.
So really what we would need is RMS to work out the average level to how loud it all is. And -10 is a good starting point if you're not super experienced. If I'm confident about the music that I'm mastering, if it's something quite loud, like a big dance thing or a rock thing, I will sometimes go -8, -7. But what I was really surprised at with Ozone was when I mastered this track, if I start pulling the limiter even more onto it, we're at about -5 RMS, actually even louder than that. And I'm not hearing the nastiness that I would normally associate with it.
Let me just turn off the maximizer and turn it back on again.
So remember, if I turn off the gain matching, so that's how much I've added. So, you know, it's really, to me, I'm not hearing, I mean, I would always be nervous about submitting a master that was at -5 RMS.
Yeah.
But it's nice to know that it just sounds great. I'm using the IRC3 on the balance setting, which is the default, and I've got it kind of between smooth and fast, okay? We've got the three, still, just as before, we've got the three different models of limiter. Now, as well as the dynamic EQ, something else that is only in advanced is this transient emphasis here. Now, on this track, it's a little bit hard to demonstrate super audibly, but essentially what this does is it retains the transients once you start putting the limiter on, because if you limit it really heavily, theoretically it's just going to squash those transients. Remember, the transients, the hits of the drums, the very quick changes in volume. But if we turn that on, we can actually like kind of bring that back in. Like I said, it is there. This track particularly is hard to kind of demonstrate because it's very full and thick. But if it was a more sort of sparse kind of track, you would really be able to notice that.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
Yeah. So I guess finally I should probably just quickly just look at the module, the existing modules, and we'll look at how they've changed.
Yeah.
Pretty much everything you could do before is here. I know that the dithering options have changed. The dithering is kept separate from the limiter nowadays. It is a bit of a different approach, but it works for me. I know some people sort of complained that they've taken away some of the other dithering options. For me, I would only ever use Mbit plus anyway, so for me it's fine, you know. I'm not trying to say those people are wrong, I'm just like, for me it's not a problem at all. If we look at the EQ, overall the interface of everything I think has been improved. Some people are a little bit saying, oh, it's quite muted, but I think really that's only in comparison to Ozone 5, which was quite day glow in comparison. I don't have a problem with that. Any of you who have seen the kind of trainers that I wear will know that that's not, you know, I have no problem with day glow. But this is nice. It's quite sober, and it's, I guess in a way, mastering is quite a sober, serious kind of business. You know, it's like you've really got to be careful and be thoughtful about what you're doing. All of the EQ bands have like, the EQ overall, it's got two different modes. It's got this analog mode and the digital one. And they just behave slightly differently. Certain bands you can put into this surgical mode, which has got super fine Q. We've got matching EQ again. Again, that's not something I use that much personally, but I know some people find that really useful. That's when you feed it something to get an EQ curve from and try to apply that to your music. Yeah. And the dynamics module, one big change here is that there's no gates. So this is something that actually I think I do miss personally, but it's not the end of the world because, as I said, maybe I'd be able to host Ozone 5 to do multiband gating. The only reason I would use the multiband gates is if I was given a master that was quite hissy and I couldn't successfully do it, noise reduce it with RX4, of course, another plug for iZotope. But I would sometimes gate off slightly the really high band so that when there was nothing going on up there, it would gate that off and it would kill the hiss. So I'd sometimes use that. Again, not the end of the world. But I think this interface is much improved. And the EQ and the dynamics and the exciter can all be used in MS as well. Okay, some of those you could use in MS before, but they've kind of put it all the way across those modules. And so I kind of like that approach, being able to use mid-side. Yep. One really cool new feature on all of the multiband stuff Actually, on the dynamics and the exciter, and on the imager as well, is the learn feature. Okay, so actually, sorry, it's on the exciter and the imager. We've got this button here that says learn. If I play the track, Ozone is going to listen to the frequencies in it and try to come up with the best crossover point that it can. So it basically divides, it listens to what's going on in the track and it divides the frequencies based on that, and it says, you know, this is what I think is the best. And I have to say, I found it quite good. It's quite, you know, it seems to come up with, so that's my high frequencies there, and then if we listen to my high mids, it's got lots of like punch in there. So it seems to have separated the real super sparkly stuff from the punchy
That is
stuff.
one of the big problems beginner producers have, especially with multi-band production, is being able to set the crossover frequency in the right place.
It's really easy to mess it up, you know. And a lot of the other stuff here is similar to before. We've got our different meters in the vector scope. We've got the Lissajous meter, which is the one that I tend to use. And again, another tip with this is, basically what you want to be seeing is, broadly speaking, vertical stuff. If you start seeing horizontal stuff that's wider than it is tall, then you've got phase problems. You're starting to push it out of phase, okay? But you know, this is all of the changes that they made to the modules. I think they all work really, really well. And I just think the standalone app, to be honest, I know it's not very sexy, but for me, it was like, when I found that out, I was like, oh wow, that's brilliant. I don't have to run it in Pro Tools. I don't have to run it in Live. I can just do it standalone and forget about everything else. So,
all right, so hopefully you got plenty of inspiration for the weekend, and do check out Ozone 6 for yourself on iZotope's website. And if you're an Ableton user, we've got a brand new mastering in Ableton module coming in January, so make sure you check that out. And then next week, we'll be joined by Martin Buttrick for a production masterclass, so we'll see you then. Cheers.